This was supposed to be a closed case, a tragic accident, a devastating headline, the kind of story that shocks everyone for a moment and then slowly fades into silence. But everything people thought they knew has now been shattered, because brand new footage that was never meant to be seen, has surfaced, and it's changing everything about the fatal car crash involving King Harris. This isn't about a small correction or a minor detail. It's about missing moments, crucial seconds that were never included in the original narrative, moments that raise new questions and bring answers that don't match what the public was told. Now people are asking why this footage was hidden, who had access to it, and most importantly, what it reveals that someone didn't want anyone to see. According to sources, this isn't just new information. It's the kind that can flip blame, rewrite timelines, and expose details that may have been buried beneath official reports. What makes it even more unsettling is that everyone who has seen the footage is saying the same thing. Something doesn't add up, not just confusing or tragic, but suspicious. And as clips begin leaking across social media while pressure builds for answers, one question is starting to take over. Was this really just an accident, or is something much bigger being covered up? Before this footage surfaced, the story seemed simple and easy to understand. A late-night crash caused by high speed and loss of control. A tragic but straightforward narrative that people accepted without much hesitation. Authorities described it as a severe collision, pointing to speed as the likely cause, with no mention of foul play or hidden details. And for a while, that explanation was enough. Fans flooded social media with condolences, sharing messages of heartbreak and disbelief, while public figures posted tributes and reminded people how quickly life can change. And the story, though emotional and heavy, remained contained because there were no major contradictions to push it further. But behind the scenes, small inconsistencies began to surface, details that were easy to overlook at first, like slight differences in the reported timeline, with some sources listing one exact time and others mentioning something slightly different. Not enough to cause immediate alarm, but enough to raise questions for those paying close attention. Then there was the lack of clear witness accounts, which felt unusual for such a high-impact crash in a semi-active area, and the few statements that did appear were vague, offering no real clarity about what actually happened. What stood out even more was the complete absence of footage, something that felt increasingly strange in a world filled with cameras, from traffic systems to nearby security feeds. Yet in this case, nothing was released, no clips, no still images, just official summaries. And while most people didn't question it at the time, a few voices quietly did, asking why there was no visual evidence and whether something was being left out. But those questions never gained traction and were quickly buried under waves of emotion and sympathy. Still, they didn't disappear. They simply lingered in the background, waiting. And as time passed, the story faded like so many others, becoming just another tragic headline that people remembered but didn't revisit. That changed the moment the footage surfaced, because according to multiple online accounts, it wasn't newly recorded. It had allegedly existed all along, stored somewhere, hidden and unreleased, captured by a nearby camera that no one publicly knew about. And when it finally leaked, everything shifted instantly. This wasn't just another angle of the crash. It was a perspective that showed moments leading up to it, moments that had never been included in the original narrative. And as people watched, replayed, and analyzed the clip, they began to notice details that didn't quite match the official version of events. At first, the video appears calm, showing a car moving normally down the road with no immediate signs of danger, nothing that suggests what's about to happen. And then, almost subtly, something changes, a slight shift in the vehicle's movement, not dramatic enough to immediately signal loss of control, but noticeable enough to stand out upon closer inspection. And then suddenly, the impact occurs. What makes this moment so unsettling is that it doesn't align perfectly with what was originally described. because there's no clear evidence of reckless driving, no aggressive swerving, no obvious mistake leading up to the crash, just a subtle, almost unnatural movement followed by the collision, and that alone was enough to spark intense debate. As viewers began breaking the footage down frame by frame, another detail started to emerge, something barely visible at first, a second object near the edge of the frame, difficult to identify but impossible to ignore once noticed, with some claiming it could be another vehicle while others argued it might just be a shadow or visual distortion. Yet the possibility itself was enough to shift the narrative, because if another vehicle was involved, even indirectly, then the original explanation might not be complete. The situation escalated further when a second clip surfaced, longer and slightly clearer, showing moments after the crash. And within those frames, there appears to be faint movement in the distance, quick and subtle, but enough to suggest that something or someone may have been leaving the scene, raising even more questions about what actually happened and why such a detail was never mentioned in initial reports. Then, just as people began focusing on these new discoveries, the footage started disappearing. Accounts that posted it were removed, links stopped working, and videos were taken down, creating a wave of suspicion that only intensified the situation, because nothing fuels doubt more than something being actively removed from public view. Around the same time, a cryptic comment began circulating, claiming that people were focusing on the wrong part of the video, which pushed viewers to dig deeper, analyzing reflections, shadows, and background details more intensely than before. And that's when someone pointed out what looked like another set of headlights in a reflection, positioned in a way that didn't match the official description of the crash scene. Adding to the confusion, an alleged document surfaced containing the line "secondary presence not confirmed at time of initial assessment," suggesting that something might have been there but wasn't fully verified, though its authenticity remains uncertain. Perhaps the most unsettling claim came from a user who stated that every version of the footage currently circulating online had been edited, and that a few crucial seconds were missing, implying that what people were seeing might not be the complete video. And although no proof was provided, the idea alone spread rapidly, especially after another detail was discovered: a brief timestamp glitch in the footage, where the video appears to skip for a fraction of a second. While it may seem minor, that single missing moment became the center of intense speculation, because 1 second is all it takes to change everything. 1 second for a new element to appear, 1 second for an action to occur, 1 second to completely alter the narrative. And if that second is missing, then the story being told might be incomplete. Now the internet remains divided, with some arguing that the footage is being overanalyzed, and that shadows, reflections, and video imperfections are being mistaken for something more significant, while others are convinced that key details are being hidden, especially as clips continue to disappear and questions remain unanswered. As a result, the focus has shifted from what is visible to what might be missing, and the central question is no longer just what caused the crash, but what hasn't been shown. Was there another vehicle involved? Was the footage edited? What happened in that missing second? Until those questions are answered, the story remains unresolved, and if the full footage ever surfaces, it has the potential to change everything once again. As more people continued to replay the footage again and again, slowing it down, zooming in, and analyzing every single frame, they began to realize something unsettling. This story might not be as simple as it once seemed. What initially looked like a straightforward accident was now raising deeper questions, and the more closely people looked, the more those questions multiplied. So the real issue quickly became this: what exactly does this footage reveal that's making so many people doubt everything they were told? Because what comes next is where the situation shifts from tragic to deeply unsettling, and once you see it, there's no going back. The moment this footage finally leaked, everything changed. At first, it didn't even seem real. The clip was short, grainy, slightly angled, and clearly taken from a distant security camera. It didn't look like something that would shake the internet, but it did. It started circulating quietly at first, passed through private messages and small groups before suddenly exploding across social media like a shockwave. People weren't even sure if it was connected to the crash at first, but then someone took the time to slow it down, zoom in, and match the location. And in that moment, everything clicked. This wasn't just any clip. This was the crash itself, but not the version anyone had been told. The first few seconds of the footage appear completely normal. A car moves steadily down the road, nothing unusual, nothing alarming. There are no immediate signs of danger, no erratic movement, no indication that something catastrophic is about to happen. If anything, the scene feels calm, almost too calm for what follows. And then Omething changes. Not dramatically, not in a way you would notice instantly, but just enough to stand out when you pay attention. The vehicle, believed to be King Harris's, appears to shift slightly. It's not a full swerve, not a clear loss of control, just a subtle movement that doesn't quite make sense. And that's the moment everything freezes for those watching. Because according to the original reports, the crash was caused by speed and a loss of control. But in this footage, there's no obvious sign of reckless driving leading up to that moment. No wild swerving, no aggressive acceleration, no visible mistake, just a sudden, almost unnatural shift followed by impact. The frame jolts, the camera shakes, and the faint, muffled sound of a collision echoes through the clip before it abruptly ends. But what truly shocked people wasn't the crash itself. It was what seemed to happen just before it. Within minutes of the footage going viral, people began analyzing it frame by frame, searching for anything that might have been missed. And that's when the first major detail surfaced. At the far edge of the frame, barely visible unless you're specifically looking for it, something appears. It's unclear, almost hidden in the background, but it's there. Some believe it's another vehicle, while others argue it's just a shadow or a trick of the lighting. But those who took the time to slow the footage down even further started pointing out something unsettling. The movement doesn't look random, and that single observation changed everything. Because if there was another vehicle involved, even indirectly, then this wasn't just about speed or loss of control anymore. It suggested interaction, and that possibility completely reshaped the narrative. Almost instantly, the comments exploded. People began debating what they were seeing, questioning why this detail had never been mentioned before. Some were convinced they had spotted another car, while others dismissed it as overanalysis. But then something even more significant happened. Users began comparing the footage side by side with the original reports, and what they found didn't line up perfectly. The angle of impact seemed slightly different, the timing didn't match exactly, and the sequence of events wasn't identical to what had been described. Now, none of these differences were definitive proof of anything on their own, but together, they created doubt. And once doubt takes hold, it spreads quickly. Just as people were focusing on the possibility of a second vehicle, another version of the footage surfaced. This one was longer, clearer, and far more unsettling. Unlike the first clip, it didn't just show the moments leading up to the crash, it also captured what happened afterward. And that's where things took a darker turn. In this
Runs deeper than
footage,
any single
there's a brief
incident.
moment where
King
something
Harris,
appears in
son
the
of T and
distance.
Tiny Harris.
It's faint, quick, and easy to miss, but once noticed, it's hard to ignore. There's movement, subtle but deliberate. And those analyzing the clip immediately pointed out that it doesn't look like random bystander activity. Instead, it appears as though someone or something is leaving the scene. This raised a whole new set of questions. If there was someone else present, why wasn't it mentioned in any reports? Why did it take so long for this footage to surface? And perhaps most importantly, why does it feel like certain details were never fully disclosed? As these questions began to circulate, speculation quickly escalated. Online threads started appearing, suggesting that the footage may have been held back. Some claimed that authorities or other parties had access to it long before it leaked, while others theorized that the initial narrative had been constructed without including everything that actually happened. None of these claims were verified, But once the idea was introduced, it became impossible to ignore. Then, just as the second clip began gaining traction, something happened that made the situation even more intense. The footage started disappearing. Accounts that had posted it were suddenly gone. Videos that were gaining attention were removed. Links stopped working. And that's when panic began to spread. Because nothing fuels suspicion faster than something being taken down. People started asking questions. Why is this being deleted? What are they trying to hide? Some claimed they had just seen the video moments earlier, only for it to vanish without explanation. And just like that, the focus shifted again. It wasn't just about what the footage showed anymore. It was about who didn't want it to be seen. In the middle of all this chaos, a single comment began gaining attention. It came from an account with no history, no followers, and no clear identity. And all it said was, "You're all looking at the wrong part of the video." That was it. No explanation, no follow-up. But that one line changed everything. Because now people weren't just focusing on the obvious details, they started digging deeper. They began analyzing reflections, shadows, background movements, anything that might reveal something hidden. And the more they looked, the more unsettling the footage became. It stopped being just a video and started feeling like a puzzle, where every frame might be hiding something important. At this point, the question wasn't just what caused the crash. It became something much bigger. What exactly is in that footage that has people questioning everything and possibly trying to make it disappear? Because whatever comes next doesn't just have the potential to change the story, it could completely rewrite it. And as the situation continued to escalate, it became clear that this wasn't just a trending topic anymore. It was consuming everything. Once the second clip began disappearing, once accounts started getting wiped and links went dead, people didn't calm down, they doubled down. The more content was removed, the stronger the suspicion became. Because in situations like this, silence and removal don't end questions, they amplify them. And with every missing clip, every deleted post, and every unanswered question, the feeling grew stronger that there might be more to this story than anyone is being told. As the footage continued to spread, and more people began analyzing it frame by frame, the situation shifted in a way no one expected. It was no longer just about what the video showed. It became about why someone might not want it to be seen. That single shift changed everything. What started as curiosity quickly turned into suspicion, and that suspicion evolved into full-blown obsession. Entire threads, communities, and discussions began forming around one central idea. If this was just a normal accident, why did it feel so controlled? That question alone was enough to push people deeper. This wasn't casual scrolling anymore. It wasn't quick reactions or surface-level opinions. People were diving into the footage with intensity, slowing it down, adjusting brightness, increasing contrast, zooming into corners that most viewers would never notice. It became a full investigation driven by the internet itself, with individuals trying to uncover details hidden within seconds of video. And then someone claimed they found something. A user who had been posting detailed breakdowns since the very first clip surfaced uploaded a zoomed-in version of the footage. But instead of focusing on the car or the crash itself, they directed attention to the background. Specifically, a reflection, barely visible, almost impossible to notice at normal speed. But once enhanced, it appeared to show something unexpected, another set of headlights. Not in front of the vehicle, not behind it, off to the side. And positioned in a way that didn't match anything described in the official reports. That single observation caused everything to explode again. Because if that reflection was real, if there truly was another vehicle present in that position, then the original explanation of the crash no longer made sense. It wouldn't just be a random loss of control anymore. It would suggest something more complex, something involving multiple elements that were never fully explained. And just as this theory started gaining traction, another twist dropped. This time, it wasn't from a random account or speculative post. It was something that appeared more official, a blurry, cropped image of what looked like an internal document. There was no clear source, no confirmed authenticity, but the formatting made it seem legitimate enough to grab attention. And within that document, one line stood out. Secondary presence not confirmed at time of initial assessment. That line alone changed the tone of the entire conversation. Because it didn't say there was nothing there, it suggested that something might have been there, but it couldn't be confirmed at the time. That implication was enough to shift perception. Suddenly, what people were seeing in the footage didn't feel like imagination anymore. It started to feel like something that may have been overlooked, or worse, left out. Of course, there was no official confirmation that the document was real. It could have been fake, edited, or completely unrelated. But the timing made it impossible to ignore. It surfaced right when the reflection theory was at its peak, and that coincidence only fueled the fire further. Now the narrative wasn't just being questioned, it was splitting apart. One group believed this was proof of another vehicle. Another dismissed everything as overanalysis and coincidence. And a third group, growing louder by the minute, believed something wasn't being fully revealed. That's when the pressure started building in a way that couldn't be contained. Media outlets began to take notice. At first, they approached the situation cautiously, using careful wording and neutral tones. But gradually, the language began to shift. Headlines no low. Ungjur described it as just a tragic accident. Instead, they started referencing questions, inconsistencies, and emerging theories. Questions arise after new footage surfaces. Online users point to discrepancies in crash video. Speculation grows over possible second vehicle. Nothing was confirmed, but the narrative was clearly changing. And once public perception begins to shift, it becomes almost impossible to reverse. Then, just when it seemed like things couldn't escalate any further, another twist hit. A user claimed they had downloaded the original footage before it started disappearing online. But instead of posting the video, they posted a single statement. There's a part missing from every version you've seen. That one line sent shockwaves through the conversation. Missing? What do you mean missing? According to this person, every version currently circulating online had been edited, cut, trimmed, altered. They claimed the original footage, before it was reposted and removed, contained a few extra seconds. Seconds that allegedly showed something no one was talking about. But here's the part that made it even more unsettling. They didn't upload it. They didn't explain what those seconds showed. They simply left one message. If you saw that part, you'd understand why it's gone. And then nothing. No follow-up, no evidence, just silence. But that silence spoke louder than anything else. Because now the focus wasn't just on what people were seeing, it was on what they weren't being allowed to see. And that's when the entire situation crossed into something deeper. People weren't just watching anymore, they were invested, emotionally, mentally, fully absorbed in trying to piece together a version of events that no longer felt complete. And in the middle of all this chaos, one question kept repeating itself. What is in that missing part of the footage that could be so significant it had to be removed? Because if something truly was cut out, something crucial, then everything seen so far might only be part of the story. And what comes next could change everything. At this point, the situation was no longer just a viral topic. It had become something much bigger, a full-blown cultural moment. Because once the idea of missing footage entered the conversation, everything escalated rapidly. Timelines moved faster than people could keep up with. Comment sections turned into battlegrounds. Entire communities dedicated themselves to analyzing every second of the footage as if their conclusions depended on it. And at the center of it all was one simple but unsettling question. What are we not being shown? Because now people weren't just reacting to what they could see, they were reacting to what they believed was being hidden. And when that mindset takes hold, it changes everything. As expected, the internet divided. On one side, there were those who believed the entire situation was being blown out of proportion. They argued that the footage was being overanalyzed, that low-quality video can easily create illusions, and that reflections or shadows can appear misleading when slowed down or enhanced. "You're seeing what you want to see," some said. This happens every time. People turn tragedy into conspiracy. There's no real proof of another vehicle. To them, the situation was simple, a tragic accident being turned into something more by speculation. But on the other side, the reaction was intense. Because those people weren't just suspicious, they were convinced. They believed the reflection was too clear to ignore. They pointed out the inconsistencies between the footage and the original reports. They questioned why videos kept disappearing if there was nothing to hide. And the more content that got removed, the stronger their belief became. Because in situations like this, removal doesn't calm suspicion, it amplifies it. And then came the hashtags. They started small but quickly gained traction. Release the full footage. What are they hiding? King Harris Truth. Once those began circulating, the pressure increased even more. Because now it wasn't just about one video, it became about transparency, about whether the public was being shown the full story. And as the online conversation intensified, something else started happening. People within the industry began reacting. Not directly, not openly, but in subtle, cryptic ways. Some posted vague messages like, "The truth isn't always what's shown, it's what's withheld." Others hinted at caution, suggesting people shouldn't accept everything at face value. No names were mentioned, no direct connections made, but the timing made it impossible to ignore. And that only added another layer of discomfort to the situation. Because now it wasn't just fans asking questions. It felt like people closer to the situation might also be hinting at something more. At this stage, the story had completely evolved. It was no longer just about a crash. It was about conflicting versions of reality. It was about whether the public had been given the full truth or just a controlled version of it. And despite everything, the footage, the analysis, the theories, there was still no clear answer. No official confirmation of another vehicle. No acknowledgement of missing footage. No explanation for the inconsistencies people believed they were seeing. Just noise. Loud, constant, emotional noise. And right in the middle of it, a growing sense that something wasn't being fully addressed. Because when a story refuses to settle, when questions keep multiplying instead of being answered, it usually means one thing. It isn't over. Not even close. And if the full footage ever surfaces, if those missing seconds are finally revealed, it could change everything all over again. As more clips continued to disappear and conversations intensified, one question kept echoing louder than the rest. Why is footage being deleted if there's nothing to hide? That single thought pushed the entire situation into a new phase, because the more content vanished, the stronger the suspicion became. People began to notice a pattern, and whether real or coincidental, it didn't sit right. Because the truth is, nothing fuels doubt faster than something disappearing in real time. And then came the hashtags. At first they were small, scattered across different posts, but they quickly began to gain traction. #release the full footage, what are they hiding, King Harris Truth. Once those phrases started circulating, even in smaller online spaces, the pressure became impossible to ignore. This was no longer just about one clip or one theory. It became about transparency, about whether the full truth had actually been shown, or if people were only seeing a controlled version of events. As the online conversation grew louder, something else began to happen. The industry started reacting, but not in a direct or obvious way. Instead, it was subtle, cryptic. Public figures who normally stayed out of situations like this began posting vague messages that felt too perfectly timed to be random. One message read, "Sometimes the truth is what's released, it's what's withheld." Another warned, "Be careful what you accept as the full story." There were no names mentioned, no clear references, but the meaning felt obvious to those already following the situation. And that's when things became even more uncomfortable, because now it wasn't just fans asking questions. It felt like people closer to the environment were hinting that there might be more going on beneath the surface. At the same time, the media began to shift its tone. Initially cautious, outlets had reported the situation as a tragic accident with little room for speculation. But now, without making direct claims, their language started to change. Segments began referencing unverified footage. Articles mentioned online theories about inconsistencies and missing moments. Even interviews, brief and carefully worded, started including questions about whether all available information had truly been released. Still, there were no confirmations, no official statements addressing the footage directly, but that silence itself began to feel loud, because at a certain point, not responding becomes its own kind of response. Then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get more intense, another moment pushed everything further. A short clip surfaced, not of the crash itself, but of the aftermath. It was brief, only a few seconds long, and at first it didn't seem significant, but within that clip, barely audible, was a voice. Faint, distorted, easy to miss unless you were listening closely. And what that voice said sent a chill through everyone paying attention. That's not how it happened. That was it. No explanation. No context, just that single line. But it was enough to shift the conversation once again. Because now people weren't just questioning what they were seeing, they were questioning the entire narrative. Who said that? What did they mean? Were they referring to something the public didn't know? Was there another version of events that hadn't been revealed? And just like that, the story evolved again. It wasn't just about a crash anymore. It became about conflicting realities, about the possibility that what people were seeing might only be one piece of a much larger puzzle. The idea that the public might have been given a simplified or controlled version of the story began to take hold, and that idea alone was enough to keep the conversation alive. Because despite everything, the footage, the analysis, the theories, there was still no clear answer. No confirmation of a second vehicle, no acknowledgement of missing footage, no explanation for the inconsistencies that people believed they were seeing, just noise. Constant, emotional, relentless noise. And within that noise, a growing feeling that something bigger was being avoided. Because when a story refuses to settle, when questions continue to multiply, instead of being answered, it usually points to one thing: this isn't over, not even close. And just when it seemed like things might begin to calm down, when people thought maybe everything that could be uncovered had already been uncovered, one final detail surfaced. It was small, easy to miss. The kind of thing most people would scroll past without thinking twice. But once it was noticed, it became impossible to ignore. It didn't come from a major account or a verified source. It didn't come from the media or anyone claiming inside knowledge. It came from someone doing something simple, watching closely. Buried within one of the reposted clips, a version that many people had already seen, a user noticed something unusual. A timestamp. But not just any timestamp, a flicker. For a split second, so quick it could only be caught by slowing the footage down frame by frame, the timestamp in the corner appeared to jump. Not forward, not backward, it skipped, like a missing frame. Or more accurately, like a missing moment. The second that observation was shared, everything shifted again. Because now the question wasn't just about what was inside the footage, it was about whether the footage itself was complete. Threads began forming instantly, with users asking if anyone else had noticed the glitch. Some dismissed it as a technical error, while others were convinced it meant something had been removed. Because if the timestamp really did skip, even for a fraction of a second, then something could have been cut out. Something small, precise, but potentially important enough to edit. And suddenly, everything started connecting in a way that felt too deliberate to ignore. The earlier claims about missing seconds, the disappearing clips, the multiple versions circulating online that didn't quite match each other, it all pointed toward one possibility: that the full footage had never been seen. Not completely, not by anyone. And that realization hit harder than anything else before it, because now it wasn't about speculation or interpretation anymore. It was about absence, about what wasn't there, what might have been removed, what could be hidden between frames. And that's when the theories reached their most intense point yet, because people began asking the question that no one had wanted to say out loud: what happened in that missing second? Think about it. 1 second. That's all it takes. 1 second to change direction. 1 second for another vehicle to enter the frame. 1 second for something unexpected to happen. 1 second to completely alter the entire narrative. And if that second is missing, then everything seen so far might be incomplete. But what made it even more unsettling was what happened next. Shortly after the timestamp theory began gaining attention, the original clip showing the glitch disappeared. Not just from one account, but from multiple sources. Different uploads, different versions, all being removed one by one. And that's when the situation reached its peak. Because now it didn't just feel like missing footage, it felt like active suppression. And once that idea takes hold, there's no going back. Because people stop questioning just the event itself, they begin questioning everything around it. Who released the footage? Who edited it? Who removed it? And most importantly, who benefits from keeping certain moments hidden? At that point, the story was no longer just about a crash. It had transformed into something much bigger. A mystery built not only on what was seen, but on what might have been deliberately kept out of view. And until those missing moments are fully explained, until the complete footage, if it even exists, is finally revealed, the questions will remain. And the deeper people look, the more they'll realize that this story isn't finished. It's only just beginning. This story was supposed to be over, filed away as another tragic accident that shocked people for a moment and then slowly disappeared from public attention. But now everything feels different. The more people revisit what happened, the more it feels like the story we were given might not be the full one. Because at the center of it all is footage that has raised more questions than answers. And the deeper people look into it, the more unsettling it becomes. What started as a simple narrative about a fatal crash has now turned into something far more complicated, something that refuses to settle. People are no longer just accepting what they were told. They're questioning it, they're analyzing it, and most importantly, they're wondering if something important has been left out. As the footage spread across the internet, reactions shifted quickly. At first, it was curiosity, people trying to understand what they were seeing. But that curiosity didn't stay calm for long. It turned into suspicion. Because the more the video was replayed, slowed down, and examined frame by frame, the less it seemed to match the original version of events. And when something doesn't line up, people notice. They start asking questions. They start looking deeper. And that's exactly what happened here. Instead of calming the situation, the footage intensified it. It made people feel like there was more beneath the surface, something they weren't being shown. Then came what many people now consider the most unsettling detail of all, a small flicker in the footage that most viewers initially missed. A timestamp glitch, just a fraction of a second where the time appeared to skip. It was subtle, almost invisible unless you were looking closely. But once it was noticed, it changed everything again. Because a skipped timestamp suggests something missing. Not just unclear, but removed. And that idea connected everything. The claims about missing seconds, the disappearing clips, the different versions of the footage. It all pointed toward one possibility, that no one had actually seen the complete video. That realization hit differently, because it wasn't about interpreting what was there anymore. It was about realizing what wasn't. And that led to the biggest question of all: what happened in that missing moment? 1 second might not sound like much, but in a situation like this, it can change everything. It can introduce something new. It can explain something unclear. It can completely alter the sequence of events, and if that second is missing, then the entire story becomes incomplete. What made it even more intense was what happened next. As the timestamp theory gained attention, those specific clips started disappearing too. Not just one version, but multiple uploads across different accounts. And that pattern made people feel like this wasn't random anymore. It felt deliberate, like something was being actively removed. And once that idea takes hold, it's almost impossible to reverse, because people don't just question the footage anymore, they question everything around it. Who had access to it? Who edited it? Who decided what stayed and what was cut? Then came a final message that added one more layer to the mystery. A silent account with no history suddenly posted a single line. It wasn't supposed to be released like this. No explanation, no follow-up. And then it disappeared. That was it. But it was enough, because it made the situation feel less like a random leak and more like something that got out in a way it wasn't meant to. Something uncontrolled, and now possibly something being contained. At this point, the story feels far from over, because even though people have seen parts of the footage, they haven't seen everything. And that's what makes it so unsettling. The gaps, the missing pieces, the unanswered questions, whether there was another vehicle, whether something was edited out, whether the full truth has been shown. None of it has been confirmed, but none of it has been dismissed either. And that leaves everything in a strange place. Not resolved, not closed, just paused, waiting. Because if the full footage ever surfaces, if those missing seconds are finally revealed, it could change everything again. Until then, all that remains are questions, and the realization that everyone is looking at the same situation but coming away with completely different conclusions. So now it comes down to perspective. Do you think the footage has been edited, or are people reading too much into it? What do you think happened in that missing moment? And if there really is more footage out there, why hasn't it been released? Because whatever the truth is, one thing is certain: this story isn't over yet.